Mikhail, I have an interesting spin-off game to show you of the Tal Paul Keres encounters. There's a fascinating one which really caught my eye. I was wondering why it really intrigued me that much, because it had something really ugly in it but really clever. And there's actually a Nimzovichian quotation about this. Nimzovich once said, "The beauty of a move lies not in its appearance but in the thoughts behind it." That's a really interesting idea, and this game I think shows that idea a little bit, like literally. I want to show you this game. So it's one of the 4 encounters Tal against Keres in 1959. Now Tal was leading the tournament at this point. Keres really had to catch him up. He had to try and play for a win with the black pieces. He played d5 here, and we get c5, and we go into Tarrasch defense territory. C takes, d5, e takes, and Tal, being in the lead, I guess he must have been thinking, well, all I need to do is get a solid position where I've got nice blockade, maybe on d4, classic blockade with minimal risk. So he plays a very popular variation, all pretty standard. Bishop e6. We have now this move, isolating black's queen's pawn. Now usually here in this position, players with white play bishop takes f6. They give up that bishop and take here, and like this has been seen quite a bit before, about equal. But Tal plays knight a4, and I guess he was expecting the bishop to just retreat, and he can set up a comfortable blockade, maybe with bishop e3 later, knight d4, rook c1, knight c5, that sort of stuff. And this is really fascinating, because sometimes I think, yeah, the Tarrasch isn't that popular nowadays, is it? Is it because of this kind of standard plan that, you know, white's going to get a blockade on the dark squares? It's a little bit potentially on the passive side. But okay, the interesting psychology of this game, Paul Keres has to try and play for a win. Can you guess what he plays here? If I give you 5 seconds starting from now. Okay, bishop b6. You might think, okay, that's not spectacular, is it? Well, white plays knight takes b6, and doesn't just get the dark square bishop. What does black play in this position, do you think? Would you take with the queen, or would you take with the pawn? Yep, hi there. Okay, everything's okay. Okay, I'm just recording. Okay.
All right. Okay.
Well, so would you take with the queen, or would you take the pawn? Okay, he took with the pawn, and now I'm thinking this looks like a wreck, this position, and I was thinking for quite a while about this game actually. What is the benefit of doing this? But if you go back to basics, what is the benefit of having the isolated queen's pawn? What is the benefit? It's these hook squares. That's one benefit. The rooks are active potentially. The bishops are active. Well, it doesn't look like a particularly active bishop at the moment. But we get a position now after knight d4 where black can try and unpin now, h6. White wants to try and sit on the position, bishop f4. And now here we get this move, queen d7. And yes, although this looks like really terrible, the thing is, by not taking with the queen, how many moves would it have taken to get there back to d7? It now means bishop h3. What does bishop h3 mean? It now means potentially that the light squares will be weakened, in particular e4. And isn't that a benefit? Going back to one of the benefits of the isolated queen pawn, to get hooks on key central squares. So in fact, black has accelerated, weakening potentially white's light squares. And perhaps Tal, he was a bit too optimistic. Maybe he should have addressed bishop h3. At the moment, it looks entirely safe because this pawn's blockaded. So what if black weakens the light squares? Maybe he felt like that, you know, so what? And he just plays the move a3. But fundamentally now, black, by playing bishop h3 now, is weakening the light squares a little bit. We see queen d3, rook f8. The rooks are pretty good as well. That's one other perk of having this isolated queen's pawn. The adjacent files, they're usually, you know, active pieces for black. So that trade-off between structure and piece activity is very interesting. But yeah, this other trade-off here is just totally radical with the black pieces to have this structure. Very innovative for the time, I mean, to do this. And to be honest, I haven't seen many examples with this particular structure, but it looks kind of attacking and aggressive. We see rook fe1, black takes on g2, and now we start to see the pressure. Rook e4 with that weakened light square. The rook goes in, immediately threatening the knight. And it's a little bit difficult here. If white plays e3, isn't this bishop going to be trapped? g5? Tal's actually been pushed on the defensive. Because now, after knight f3, maybe knight c2 was slightly better, by the way. But after knight f3, can you see what black plays now? And things are starting to get uncomfortable for white after this next move. What does black play in this position? Okay, d4. Yeah. No. Not d4. Not yet. d4 is soon to be played. Rook e8, pardon me. We see bishop d2 because g5 is still like on the cards. We see bishop d2. If, for example, a4, just to show the threat. Actually, rook takes f4 is also a major threat in this position as well. Knight h5, threatening to fork king and queen. Rook e4, and black's going to be winning here. So actually this is a significant little threat in the position, not little. Rook takes f4 is actually threatened here. So bishop d2 actually gets out of that, and also if white wanted to play maybe e3 later as well, that g5 is relevant. But now d4, this time round d4. And all of a sudden you see that from that earlier terribly ugly looking move, what black has done is exchange off bishops which maybe shouldn't have been allowed, which weakened key light squares. Then a rook went in there, getting a knight back, which liberated the pawn, which now means d5 is available to the queen, which now means then later there's going to be a pin piece, a horrible pin piece on this weakened light square diagonal. So we see e3, queen d5. Black's doing great here all of a sudden. Let's go back to Nimzovich's thing. So he said, the beauty of a move lies not in its appearance but the thought behind it. And I just think this is a stunningly beautiful concept. But of course, Mikhail Tal perhaps had better play so far. But black has achieved a fantastic position from this earlier, seemingly terrible structural decision, which most of us wouldn't have entertained. We have e takes d4. Now some tactics. Black to play here. 5 seconds. What does black play here? Rook takes d4. Yes, we got that pin on the knight. Rook takes e8. Knight takes. Queen drops back. Black has dissolved finally that isolated queen spawn, but he could still argue, well, he's still got those horrible double pawns there. Knight d6, but black has got huge piece pressure now as compensation. Bishop e3, rook d3, and it would be far too dangerous to take on b6 here. This would be terrible because of knight c4 actually gaining tempo on the bishop, and followed up with knight e5. For example, bishop c5 trying to lure the queen away from the rook, but knight d2, and look at that pin, it's winning there on f3. And also bishop e3, this looks terrible for knight e5. Yeah, it looks absolutely terrible. There's major threats because of that pinned knight. So yeah, white doesn't really want to take on b6 here. He unpins, Tal unpins, knight c4, protecting b6 and threatening knight takes e3, knight e1, hitting the rook moves, so still protecting the pawn now twice, threatening knight takes e3. Yeah, white's under great pressure here, b2 pawn's attacked. Tal plays rook c1, so if he just passively defends, knight takes e3, queen e4, and this position is horrible after knight d4, rook takes e3, it's horrible for white. Look at the amount of piece pressure that black's generated basically. So okay, after this, yeah, we see rook c1, knight takes e3, and white's getting the structural damage now. Things are looking as bad as each other now in terms of pawn structure, but black has the slightly more active pieces, and with those actually e3 might even be a more significant weakness than b6. White's defending now and losing that pawn. Rook takes b2. Yeah. A shocking outcome, you might think, from black's earlier decision. Knight f4, rook b3, some simplification, queen b3, looking at b6, b5, if takes then queen e3, well that actually happens, so black's still a pawn up, and white's king side is looking a little bit on the shaky side. Now here, a very clever move by Paul Keres against his b7 pawn. What to do about b7, or what would you play here? If I give you 5 seconds, black's play. Okay, he gives it up. He accelerates the aggression and the aggressiveness of the queen and knight around the king. So knight d3, threatening mate. Check. Queen f5 protecting f2. But queen d2 on e1. Great coordination on e1. The knight holds against the checks. Pardon me. Knight d4. There's still a bit of work to do here. It looks as though, well, what has black actually gained? He can kick the king around now. It's equal on pawns, but he can kick Tal's king around for a bit, which he does. Queen e3 now hits the knight. Queen f2, check. Yeah, a lot of checks. Check, check. Takes a pawn, so he's a pawn up now, and still kicking the king around. Queen e4 there, gets out of the discovered checks there, check. Knight e6, okay, we see knight c4, knight e5, pins the knight, takes another pawn. Yeah, white's on his way out here. He's losing all his pawns. He's actually now lost all his pawns. Okay, but it does take on f6. A little bit of work to do here. Check for black. King gets out of the way. Yeah, here if knight takes, there's queen f8 check, and then taking that knight. h5. Knight e5 now. So if queen takes, there's knight f7 check, forking king and queen. Yeah, bit of a grind. Check. knight g4, knight f2, and the pawns start advancing, and it starts to be clearer and clearer that black is not going to slip up. Knight e4, it's the queen, queen g4 pins, and it's here actually Tal resigned. Yeah, this is a very nasty pin at the end, in fact. Very nasty. If we look at this final position, if queen e6, not queen takes because that's check, but maybe knight d6 check just to get rid of the knights. That gets rid of the knights. And if the king went there, then we just torture the pinned piece. Yeah, so black's winning now much more clearly off the queen g4. Now this is a game which most YouTubers will stay away from because it's 79 moves. And the reason I wanted to show you it is the duality of chess. It's this very early, terribly unaesthetic, it seemed, structural decision. And I was just wondering, Keres's concept actually took our existing concepts of the isolated queen's pawn and looked at the implementation. Okay, the isolated queen pawn has hooks, it has active pieces. How would you accelerate that? How would you accentuate the perks of the isolated queen's pawn? So this damaged the structure. Yeah, he got rid of white's light square bishop. He accentuated the e4 hook. He actually got a rook in there, which drove the knight back, which liberated the pawn, which created an enormous pin. He still had a lot of work to do. He gave up eventually both of the double pawns for a fierce king chase, basically, and he had to grind Tal down. But this was such an important game to try and catch Tal up. You know, he was a fierce contender in this tournament and came second to Tal, but he was an absolutely fantastic player, Paul Keres. And out of all of the games I've shown you, this is one of the that was like 9 years back. A lot of the games I've already shown you, but this is like 1959. Paul Keres had a fantastic tournament, except he just didn't score as heavily against the lower rated players in the tournament like Fischer. Tal, on the other hand, wiped out Fischer in this particular tournament, like 4-0. But I found this game intrinsically fascinating with that early structural decision, which you might think is absolutely shocking. But yeah, look at the mechanics of the isolated queen's pawn. How would you exacerbate its perks? And maybe the beauty of the game, you'll see that this game is kind of beautiful in that way, the thinking behind this structural sacrifice. Okay, comments, questions, likes appreciated. Thanks very much.